In 1832, military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously stated that war is merely the continuation of politics by other means. Since then, Clausewitz's statement has been proven true time and again. Massive conflicts such as the US Civil War and the Second World War erupted as a result of social and geopolitical strife, forcing regular citizens to lift weapons in defense of governmental policy. Some, however, have refused to do so when they felt that the government they served had violated the principles they served. This phenomenon of military dissent is at the core of Chris Lombardi's book, I Ain't Marching Anymore. Published in November 2020 by the New Press, I Ain't Marching Anymore provides a comprehensive record of the long history of dissent in the United States military. Weaving together deeply researched narratives from the Revolutionary War through the present day, Lombardi, who is a freelance journalist and a member of the Democratic Left editorial team, shows that US soldiers have been aware of their roles as enforcers of policy and ideology from the very beginning. I Ain't Marching Anymore shatters stereotypes about the military as a right-wing monolith, asserting that military dissenters are a powerful political force that can and should be utilized by the US progressive movement. I'm Alexander Lee, coming to you from New York City with Democratic Left. Chris Lombardi is joining us today from her home in Philadelphia. Chris, I'm incredibly excited to be speaking with you today. Welcome.
I'm so glad you're doing this, Alex. Thank you.
So I'll just jump right into my questions. So in your book, you write that the soldiers who volunteered to fight for the Union Army in the Civil War were themselves, in a way, dissenters against the slave power. When I was reading the book, I was really interested by this concept because I felt that it contradicted somewhat with the idea that these soldiers were also enlisted soldiers following orders. So how do you reconcile these two somewhat contradictory things?
This is all about what doing all those wars I talk about. There are a couple of wars people think of as the good war, Civil War and World War II. How do I see what happens in those things, and how do I see dissenters developing in there? And when I realized that in terms of when you look at the 1860s, Abraham Lincoln was sort of running a campaign, an insurgent campaign against a very powerful force, and the Union Army that he hired was thinking of themselves as dissenters. I also, however, the other piece of it is looking at dissent when they become veterans. So Civil War, as you know, end up with people who are powerful in the wars after. It's kind of it's a conceit, certainly. It's a way of thinking about Civil War that is not usually thought about in terms of military. But when I talk to veterans, they kind of get it.
So when you speak to veterans, many of them do feel that it is possible to have a justified war within a larger anti-war framework.
Well, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about conscientious objection because I got started on this with conscientious objection, and there's something called selective objection that veterans are much more into. You should be able to choose which war you are supporting or not, and that's kind of contradictory because, of course, not the way the military works. That you could pick and choose what you do, but only wars that don't have public support, that's more, you get more dissent. You know, I mean, over 1812, you know, the massive desertion, and they should have figured out that this was not going to work. Then I think that veterans figure that they are serving a country that, and
most of your book is a historical study, but and I'm kind of jumping around with these, so you know, if you want to take an direction,
it's cool.
You do cover modern dissent in the form of people like Reality Winner. I'm wondering if there's a way that the phenomenon of modern military dissent ties in with other concurrent social movements like Black Lives Matter or other things that people are fighting for on the left right now.
I mean, writing some versions of history, it had to be intersectional, and the whole issue of the whole thread of what happens in terms of the African American presence in this country, that's got to be a big piece of it. And I was very careful to make sure throughout the book. And that's why I have Lewis Douglas, who's Frederick Douglass's son, who then became a dissenter against the Philippine War afterward, and was a witness to what was going on with Reconstruction as well. And you go on from war to war, you see World War II, there was the Port Chicago Mutiny, where they hired the Navy hadn't recruited Black people at all. And when they got these guys, they said, you're going to load ammunition, and a very dangerous thing. And the officers didn't want to do it. and a bunch of these guys realized that when one of the ships exploded, they said, we're not going to do it either, and they were court-martialed for it. And I believe that has not been even now addressed in terms of history later on, their discharges being reversed. So there's a whole tradition of the way that the country has treated African Americans. And my uncle, when he read the book, he said to me, it's not just about war, it's about race. Yeah, everything's about race, Uncle. It's certainly, and this book is about dissent and about, and as I said in my afterwards, I said a long time ago, if you want a revolution, it's going to be anti-war veterans. The people who have had military experience and realize that something's wrong have a perspective that no one else has. And that was the entire book is tribute to that. And
so, as you've said, there's such a strong just through line of racial justice throughout all of these tales of military dissent. And it's not just racial justice that motivates dissent throughout your book. It's really people fighting against systems of oppression of all kinds. There are military dissenters who fought against Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and in favor of the rights of LGBT service members. There are countless women who you recount either disguising themselves as men in earlier wars or fighting for the rights of female service members later on. All of these ideas, this core idea of fighting against oppression, is something that is very progressive. It's very much a left-wing ideal. But you do in your book cover a few right-wing military dissenters, people like Timothy McVeigh. And I was wondering, do you feel that there is something about the military experience that pushes most dissenters in the military towards the left? Or was it more of a conscious choice for you to avoid covering as many right-wing dissenters in your book?
More the latter, because there's a lot is being written about. For example, Kathleen Belew wrote this amazing book called Bring the War Home about the Vietnam veterans who basically created the white power movement in this country in the 20th century. And I made a choice because I don't have much room. I really wanted to highlight people who were on this progressive path. I mentioned Timothy McVeigh because he broke the 90s in half. Had to happen. But I constantly don't give it as much room as I give the others because I want to track this other thing. But I think that it's right now with January 6th, it's almost like a turf battle because you've got all these veterans who crashed the Capitol, but I written articles for Waging Nonviolence about all the veterans on the other side who've been working to support Black Lives Matter. And so it's trying to give some support to a very vital area of activism.
So since we are a DSA magazine, I do want to ask about how socialism specifically works into the instances of military dissent that you mentioned. You've told me that there are, a contingent of military dissenters working within DSA already, and you also cover some notable socialists, throughout the narrative of I Ain't Marching Anymore. Could you tell me a little bit more about the specific history of socialism in the military, even if it isn't necessarily the dominant voice in military dissent?
Well, and Joseph Kasabian, who helped me. You mentioned that I edited an issue of Democratic Left 2 years ago, summer 19, and it was an anti-imperialism issue. And I talked to a guy named Joe Kasabian, who is a science fiction writer and really big. Has a memoir called The Hooligans of Kandahar about his time in Afghanistan. And he's a member of the DSA Veterans Working Group, which is not as active as we would like it to be, but people have priorities, they have lives. But he said to me at one point, we should have an article about the fact that the military is the ideal of socialism. You join the military, you get health, you get everything you need, and it's interesting that the structure of the military is basically national service, and in an ideal world, that's everything you want. When you're people who join the military are usually people who don't have the most resources in the world, and it's what we call the poverty draft. And then you have this institution that is giving you everything, and that understanding that you want to extend that to everybody else is part of what makes these guys go. In terms of who's in the book, I mentioned to you on email, W.B. Du Bois. We're talking about race, And Du Bois only gets in the book, my criteria, you have to have had some interaction with the military, like even if he was commissioned for like one day, and then southern legislators and the management NAACP said, nope, you don't want to do that. But he ended up a communist and was arrested in 1954 because he was doing peace work about the Korean War. And his whole the African roots of war, he wrote a lot very deeply about. War is also has at its bottom racism and colonialism. And settler colonialism is something that, every time I read something like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's work, I'm like, I don't give near enough to what was done to the natives of this country. But I do have a couple of characters who were native themselves that are in the book as well.
And I thought your discussion of Silas Soul was poignant as well, and brought that in a pretty serious way. So, not to interrupt, sorry.
No, I want what that is, a Silas Soul movie. Hasn't happened yet.
I would watch that. I also, just speaking about how you qualified people as dissenters, I love some of the more shoehorned examples, like Mark Twain. I think certainly fits the bill, and I think you gave him just the amount of attention that his military service, deserved. But I thought that was an interesting aspect of just your book acknowledged that military service comes in a lot of forms, and I don't think that that's an unfair thing to do. I do want to talk a little bit more about the specific creative process behind the creation of this book. And one thing that I really enjoyed was how you used some sort of narrative nonfiction elements. You kicked off each chapter by sketching out an actual scene, and in some cases actually using dialogue. And I was wondering, how many of these snippets of dialogue are real quotes that you were able to find, or how much of these scenes were just sort of recreations based on, anecdotes that you may have heard, and why did you decide to use this sort of narrative nonfiction to tie the narrative together?
Well, narrative nonfiction is absolutely the hardest thing anyone can write. As someone who spent a long time trying to be a novelist, I can tell you narrative nonfiction is harder. You write something, it has to be true. If you write that it was February, it better be cold that day, because go look at the weather report and that it was a sunny day. So that kind of thing you need to do. Because I started as a novelist. I love the idea of being a book making a dream, and I wanted that piece for the readers. In terms of how I got the pieces, I went and checked out. You shared this question with me earlier, and only one of the chapters opens with. There are two chapters that open with actual dialogue. One was Suzette Schnall flying over Northern California, and that was from when she told me about it when I interviewed her. But the one Lewis Milestone and the Klan guy, that's from he wrote a non-published memoir that I found at the Beverly Hills Library.
Wow,
100 pages of unpublished memoir that Lewis Milestone wrote, never got published, like an autobiography that never got published. And
and just for our watchers, Lewis Milestone was the director who created All Quiet on the Western Front.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. And the story, so he's gonna know, is it's 1921 and 22 or something like that. Later than that. Anyway, he's online on the Warner studio, and everybody's kind of in line waiting for the flickered the speakeasy to open, and this young man with a clipboard is going around and getting people to sign things up. And this is Lewis Milestone, who was born Louis Milstein. And so the guy's like, so what are people signing? And the guy says, it's the Klan. And Milestone says, well, you don't want me. And the guy who's with says, what is that? I'll tell you about it later. I can't believe he has to say his I will tell you the facts of life, maybe, but I couldn't make that up. So I had to use it.
Yeah, I mean, as someone, as a Jewish American myself, that was a poignant that was a poignant anecdote, and the idea of him changing his name to become more American is something that is part of my own family story as well. So I'm glad you included that, and that bit about you digging that out of his unpublished memoir is a really interesting detail. And just something I want to say in general was I appreciated how thoroughly you cited all of your research in this book. It was a work of narrative nonfiction, but it was also, it was and is an academic work that hopefully will be built on by future writers the same way that you built on, seminal works of military history in your own book. So
I put in footnotes first. I was putting in footnotes to keep myself honest, because so often people write nonfiction and they're like, oh, they know it's kind of true, and I wanted to make sure that I knew I was able to see, and I didn't know that it was going to get published that way. I sent to my editors saying, since it's all real, and no, I can keep them. So I'm glad people know what I did.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't know that was kind of just a relic of your own editorial or authoring process, but
yeah,
I read all of I actually went through afterwards and went through the footnotes and compared them to the passages, and it really improved my experience of reading it. So I'm glad that they were in there. So taking a bit of a pivot, I wanted to get to this question before we ran out of time. You discuss, obviously, All Quiet on the Western Front, which is one of the most powerful pieces of military cinema ever created. But the concept of military dissent has been portrayed in countless books and films since then. Most recently, I remember watching *Da 5 Bloods*, the Spike Lee movie, which is, I think, covers a lot of the same ideas of racial justice and injustice with regard to the Vietnam War that you covered in your book. I was wondering, aside from, All Quiet on the Western Front, what, in your opinion, are the most accurate or powerful portrayals of military dissent in cinema or literature or popular culture?
Well, the easiest person to mention is, of course, Oliver Stone, who, you talk about *Five Bloods*, I think about *Platoon*, of course, but his *Born on the 4th of July* is one of the only, you talk about portrayal of actual military dissent, not just portrayal of how horrible the war was. That's harder to find, actually. But *Born on the 4th of July*, Ron Kovik's whole curve of from Vietnam to being active Vietnam veterans against the war, and really honoring that. And he actually then went on to make *Snowden*. And I didn't manage to have *Snowden* in my book, but then Oliver Stone did what I was going to do and trace Snowden's commitment back to having had basic training and believing the Army values and all of that. Because what's interesting to me about these people is that, they want to be part of something bigger, and they learn some basic values that, when I talk to people, they'll recite the Army values, the Navy values. They take them seriously, and so when they think that their command didn't do it, it's a big deal.
So, I mean, you talk about, these concepts like Army values, Navy values, and obviously you've immersed yourself in this world. I mean, and it's something you're very familiar with, but it feels very personal when you talk about the military nowadays. And which just brings me to another one of my questions. What motivated you to write this book? Did you have some kind of personal connection to the military that got you interested in this subject in the first place?
No, I was your basic sort of liberal writer 30 years ago now, 25 years ago. In 1995, I got a job with the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors, editing a magazine called The Objector. But this was early 90s, and the GI Rights Hotline, GIRights.org, guys, had just been formed. And my coworker was getting all these calls from GIs. And then I got trained how to do it too. And suddenly part of my job was talking to soldiers every day. And that completely blew my mind. I was like this San Francisco liberal, and suddenly I'm talking to people from all over the country, and they want to know how to get out. And I realized that these were people that were really earnest, as I was. In San Francisco, I was kind of too earnest. It wasn't as slacky as people there. And I coordinated a hotline there. I coordinated a group of volunteers there. Most of them were Vietnam veterans. And that's that line I said, if you want a revolution, I meant the Vietnam veterans that I worked with. Who, a guy named Steve Morse, who will probably not watch this, but he taught me about, he was part of the GI movement. He actually handed out, he trained people to be anti or inside the military. He joined because he wanted to work against the war, which the whole GI movement was a very big deal. And so when I walked to journalism school, I was like, this is fascinating. And when I went to Columbia and talked to Sam Friedman, who runs the book seminar, said, I want to write a book about the GI rights hotline, because it was kind of interesting. You got one side, you got these people at Fort Benning or wherever who calling the GI rights hotline to find out. And then you've got people like me or ministers or hippies or whatever. But Sam Friedman in 2005 says, you should write a narrative history of soldiers who dissent. This is the year after John Kerry did not become president. And I was like, all right. And that took 15 years to do. But that's how it happened.
It's so interesting that you mentioned John Kerry, because I have to say the section about Kerry was one of the most eye-opening parts for me as a 26-year-old person reading the book. John Kerry is someone who I associate with the Democratic Party. I think of him as kind of I don't think of him of dissent when I think of John Kerry. I think of a very staid Boston Brahmin Democratic Party politician. And for me, he was kind of part of my awakening as someone, as a liberal. The 2004 election was one of the earliest elections that I really was, I wouldn't say I was involved, but I was aware of in any way. So it was mind-blowing to me to read about John Kerry as this almost radical dissenter, the most prominent arguably the most prominent Vietnam veteran who spoke out against the war. And I'm just wondering, as someone who has studied and been writing about this work for years, what was your reaction to seeing John Kerry's transformation over the many years, from radical dissenter to U.S. presidential candidate? And do you think that such a loss of radical ideals is something that is inherent to running for office like that?
I'd like to think that the second part is not true. I mean, but Sanders managed to run for president without completely giving away his ideals. John Kerry, when you think about him now, the fact that he's kind of Boston Brahmin, coming from a privileged family, but Vietnam was such an extreme place, and I have tried often to connect with Envoy Kerry to see if I can interview him, or at least let him know that I've written about him, because the arc is somewhat predictable in some ways, like a rich guy doing saying that you can only dissent this far, but forget the rest of it. But I don't understand to this day why he doesn't talk about it more. His campaign bio did actually mention Operation Dewey Canyon and all those veterans showing up in DC to practice democracy in April of 1971, just 50 years ago, guys.
Right, which is what launched his political career, more or less.
Yeah, and that's what he spoke to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that week, exactly. And the fact that he doesn't touch back on it now, when he hasn't anything to lose. He's trying to make dramatic action on climate. People need to really all hands. And what he doesn't say, by the way, I was challenging everything this time 50 years ago. I don't know why he doesn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating transformation, and really, it's heartbreaking in some ways just to see what he was before I was aware of John Kerry. Well, I'm sorry to end on such a depressing note, but real quick, I wanted to ask, that's everything I wanted to ask. If you had any shout outs you wanted to give, or just any interesting topics that, we sort of touched upon but didn't get to elaborate on. Was there anything else that you wanted to discuss?
One thing is that I haven't done this interview on Juneteenth, so I have to just have a moment for Juneteenth.
Oh, yes.
And this is important. And the other is, you mentioned Reality Winner. And the other thing that happened this week is that Reality Winner, who by the way was a drone veteran, who was working for NSA and saw that there was evidence that the Russians had gotten Trump elected, and he let the public know about it, and has been in prison ever since. And she's now on home confinement, and she's home, and she's not. So that's really cool. And we're still fighting for her to get a full pardon or a commutation. And so people go to standwithreality.org and see what you can do. And
that's, you heard it here, folks. Standwithreality.org. I thank you for mentioning that.
And otherwise, 8marchand.com is where you find out more about me, and also you can get opportunity to buy the book in any means you like, Amazon, bookshop, or whatever.
I do want to end on that note. This is a fantastic book. If you are at all interested in the progressive movement in the United States or the history of military service in the United States, I think there's something in here for you. So I would say, first go to Stand With Reality, or sorry, what is it?
Standwithreality.org.
First go to standwithreality.org.
8marching.net.
And then go to 8marching.net and order your copy of this informative book. So thank you again, Chris. I think that's all the time we have right now. It's been great to talk to you about this. And thank you to our audience for joining us on this latest Democratic Left Zoomcast.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
In solidarity.